It is a truism, and one very well demonstrated by social sciences research, that money can't buy happiness. Of course, we have to immediately qualify this. If someone's basic needs, the lowest needs in the Maslow hierarchy, like food, safety, and shelter, if those basic needs are not being met because of a lack of money, then money can indeed buy happiness. Money that lifts people out of poverty buys a lot of happiness. But once those basic needs have been met, increases in money provide rapidly diminishing returns in terms of increases in happiness, something called the hedonic treadmill, which is a phrase that makes me terribly happy. At the higher levels of wealth, increases in money can actually lead to diminishing levels of happiness, and it's not too hard to imagine why that might be. Researchers have found, however, that there is at least one way in which money can reliably buy happiness, and that is if you give it away. You give it away. Unitarian Universalist philanthropy expert Mark Ewert, in his book, The Generosity Path, references a 2008 study at Harvard Business School. 632 Americans of various income levels who were asked to record their budgets and how they spent their money and how much money they had and what they did with it for an entire year and how they rated their own happiness. And Harvard found no relationship between how much money people spent on themselves and their level of happiness. But those who spent money on others reported a higher level of happiness consistently. Similarly, researchers at the University of British Columbia did an experiment where they randomly gave college students a surprise windfall, an envelope with between $5 and $20 in it, and the stipulation was you have to spend this by the end of the day. Spend it on yourself, give it to others, do whatever you want with it, but spend it by the end of the day. And then the students were instructed to report their level of happiness. Students who spent the money on themselves were no happier than before. Students who gave the money away were happier. And there was no relationship between the amount of money and the happiness. The only relationship was whether or not it was given away. And finally, according to a 2018 report by the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, and again, I'm happy to know there's such a thing as the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, but according to their 2018 report, generosity in any of its forms, giving money, giving time, giving attention, volunteering, even picking something up off the ground that someone else has dropped, leads to increased happiness. It also leads to increased health, real measures of health like lower mortality, lower blood pressure, better sleep, similar improvements. Generosity is also associated with less burnout at work and more stable long-term relationships. So the science is in. Becoming more generous, which is defined as giving good things to others freely and abundantly, is a spiritual practice that leads to rich benefits for ourselves and for others. Generosity, says Ewert, can have many expressions, including care, time, skill, intelligence, gifts, and money. Now, as it happens, we're entering a season in which gift giving, thinking of others, and the practice of charity is highly elevated in the cultural consciousness. So this is a good time to talk about generosity. But I hope one of your takeaways from this sermon will be that generosity is far too important to our spiritual lives to think about seasonally, or to talk about seasonally, or to feel some renewed vigor for seasonally. Too often our culture encourages us to think of generosity as a heartfelt act of sentiment, something that happens to like swelling strings of music and Hallmark moments, right? And Scrooge giving away the turkey and all that kind of stuff. But I would like you to think of generosity as a practice, not something that is done randomly, spontaneously, opportunistically, whimsically, or yes, seasonally, but something that grounds, grows, and expresses an inward spiritual life of abundance and courage, gratitude and vulnerability. Generosity is something we can practice. It is like a muscle we can exercise or a skill we can become more proficient at. It is something our hearts and spirits grow into. Yet, what we are taught about generosity, what it is and how we might practice it in our homes, growing up, by our institutions, by our peers, what we are taught is as varied as each individual's experience in life. Certainly, the relentless bombardment of images we receive from late capitalist consumer culture, from the cradle to the grave, schools us a great deal more in getting and consuming than it does in giving and sharing. So I'd like to do a short mental exercise now, very informally. This is an exercise I learned from Amy Larimore, who spent 5 years as Associate Director of the Lake Institute of Giving and is now the philanthropic strategist for the first PhD program in African American preaching in the country here at our own CTS, Christian Theological Seminary. And the exercise is, we're just going to take about a minute, think back about your early life, and ask yourself, who were the people who taught you how to give? And how did they teach you that? What was the lesson and how? Positive or negative, that you learned about generosity as a young person. So we're going to take about a minute, think, reflect, who were the people who taught you how to give, how and what? And when we come back, we're actually going to pass the microphone around, and there'll just be a moment for people to share with the congregation who taught you to give and what and how. Okay, so just a short little exercise. Now, are there any generous souls who would like to share about 15 or 20 seconds with the room about who taught you to give and how? If you just want to raise your hand, Matt will bring you the microphone. All over here.
My grandmother, Marie, had an amazing ability to make each person feel heard. So she was very generous in her attention. And my mother was very generous in her time and volunteer work.
Mike's right behind.
My father, the first thing, several things, but I'll just mention one. He owned a shoe store and provided the boots to Santa every year and took them back after the season and oiled them up and got them ready for the next year.
Wow.
My brothers and sister and I grew up in a town with a big Sears store, and every Christmas they had a huge stocking full of toys, and you could put your name in a pot and get drawn out. And we were little hooligans and ruffians, and we loaded the pot with our names. And one year my little brother Charlie won, and my father and mother had us take all of the toys down to a local charity who gave the toys to. I think it took about a year or two for it to sink in that that was a good thing. But
Someone in the center, anyone?
I would have to say my father, who not only was very generous to the church, but we were of limited means, but he was very generous to the church I grew up in. But beyond that, he was also an elected official who was responsible for providing relief to people in need, and I was always impressed with how he embodied in that role the dignity of each person who came in need to receive help from the state.
This is kind of nice, Jamie, because I thought I was going to not say my dad, but I think my dad taught me to give. I grew up calling my dad stingy, but he was very frugal, actually. So my dad taught me to give what was needed, right? Like he always gave us, for the most part, we always told him, can you buy like 8 pairs instead of 4? But he would buy what was needed. And he also had a shoe store, and he always has given all his grandkids free shoes throughout the whole year. So just a nice shift of mindset.
Through church, we were always given trick or treat for UNICEF boxes. So any pennies or nickels that were tossed into our trick or treat bag all went to UNICEF. I have a birthday right before Christmas, and when I was in 6th grade, my father thought it'd be a great idea if all the kids who came to the party brought a gift that could be donated to other children. And I think I was with John. It took a long time before I realized what a wonderful experience that was.
Maybe 2 more if 2 more people want to share.
Well, I think I had 2 lessons that stand out. One is growing up, my mother took a particular interest in giving to recent immigrants. She was a teacher and gave a lot of her time after hours working with students that she saw as very promising but underserved. And she also had a very personal attitude toward giving in identifying families that were in particular need, who she met either as students or otherwise through our community. And she would take them physical things, clothes and books and things like that. And so that was my, I think, introduction to that personal connection with an individual type of giving. And then I think as a college student, I had the experience of thinking about how to give to change structures in community, and how to think about how to give of your time in ways that might help change a political organization or a neighborhood or something like that, to realize that just giving to one individual might not accomplish those goals for serviced, privileged communities.
And one last person?
So my mom taught me about the gift of giving, and I had a birthday I had to spend in the hospital when I was 9, turning 10, and I had pneumonia, and I had to spend 2 weeks in an oxygen tent. So somebody got me this nice paper bag full of all this candy that I didn't care for, and then somebody got me the super large bag of Dum Dum suckers. So trying to be a good steward, I'm not going to eat this candy in the paper bag. I told one of the nurses, let's go ahead and just distribute that to all the other kids in the ward. Well, they took my bag of Dum Dums and did that, and I was mad. But having all the nurses that were on staff for the next couple days just kept coming in the room and thanking me, and then I realized that was actually a good thing, and I'll live with the candy I didn't like.
Awesome. All right, thank you for sharing, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for your mad microphone running skills. So the good news is humans have a natural desire to be generous. We have a natural desire to be generous. The Greater Good Science Center points out that generosity has its roots not just in our individual development, but also in our very biology and our evolutionary history. Species as diverse as bees, birds, vampire bats, rats, and chimpanzees all exhibit forms of generosity, what can be broadly described as pro-social behavior, acts that benefit others. And they conclude that the broad occurrence of generosity across species suggests that generosity may be an evolutionary adaptation that has helped to promote the survival of the species, including our own. So it is natural for us to want to give. Giving feels good, it's good for us, it's good for society. At the same time, there are lots of things that might play against our natural desire to give and to give abundantly to one another. And many can be reduced to a lack of feeling of abundance in ourselves and in our own lives. It is difficult to act abundantly if we don't feel abundant. And the most commonly mentioned obstacle to generosity, according to Mark Ewart in The Generosity Path, is a lack of time. A lack of time. If we feel that we lack free time and flexibility, if we feel hurried and harried, if we feel that our time is a resource that is stretched thin and is scarce, then we are less likely to be generous when the opportunity arises. Generosity, says Ewart, requires us to slow down. It requires us to notice our surroundings. It requires attention and attendance. It requires patience. So this would be true whether we're talking about giving money or giving volunteering time or just giving attention, doing the emotional labor of connecting with someone, right? And he says if we don't give ourselves enough time to fulfill our own needs, it may be very difficult to give time to someone else. So if we're not feeling abundant in time, that impacts our generosity. Material scarcity, of course, real or perceived, may also hold us back from giving. If we're not feeling materially abundant, if we have a fear of not having enough for ourselves, then it is difficult to give abundantly. Ewart relates a story of how a friend asked him to make a charitable donation to a nonprofit. He says, I know that a number of her family members suffered from a medical condition that the nonprofit worked to alleviate, and how important the issue was to my friend. Still, he says, I dismissed it because the gift would not fit into my charitable priorities or my planning. But then he says, upon reflection, I realized that my reaction came from the fact that in my professional life, I had recently done a sizable amount of work and not received payment. And although this did not put me in any serious financial jeopardy, it did make me worry about my finances, and it affected my mood as well. And so my uncertainty, he concludes, led me not to consider my friend's request. And there's also finally a fear of being exhausted by the needs of the world, right? Giving fatigue, like compassion fatigue, is a real thing. We can be overwhelmed with the number of causes coming at us, sometimes it seems from all sides, on TV, on the radio, in our social media feeds, at church, at work, in our neighborhoods, just driving or walking down the street. All worthy causes, all vying for our attention, and for some of our necessarily limited resources. So just the range of options can produce a feeling of being overwhelmed, and maybe a sense that our small contribution can't possibly make a difference in the face of so much need. So why give it all? Also, many people feel, Ewart says, that expanding your generosity, he says, is like opening up a fire hydrant on the street, that this gushing surge of water will come out that would be hard to control. So last week we read the story of the giving tree, right, where the boy's relentless demands from the abundantly generous giving tree ultimately remove the tree's leaves, her branches, eventually even her trunk, leaving her a lonely stump in a field. Now, the book lends itself to multiple interpretations, but one of those is certainly as a cautionary tale against boundaryless giving. And perhaps its imagery is so effective precisely because it does capture some of our deep-rooted fears that to give is to risk giving completely. It is to risk being consumed, or to risk being taken advantage of, right? Showering abundant love on a world that will not necessarily love us back. So to be generous with the world is to risk. It is to be purposefully vulnerable. And as such, as we know from Brene Brown's work, it requires courage. Vulnerability requires courage. And being vulnerable, being courageous, taking that risk to be generous is a choice we make. And so like any choice, it can become a habit, a practice, a discipline. We can lean into and develop our own innate capacity for generosity, or we can lean away from it. But choosing courage and vulnerability, choosing any path that requires risk, is made easier when we start from a sense of our own strength. So Mark Ewart in The Generosity Path asks his readers, before they begin working on a practice of greater generosity, he asks them at the very beginning to take a generosity assessment. And this is partly to identify our existing thoughts and feelings about generosity, those lessons that we learned throughout our life. But it is also to recognize all the ways in which we are already generous as a place to start from and build on. So he asks about self-care. How generous are we with ourselves? He asks about mentoring. How generous are we with our skills and our professional connections and our attention? He asks about appreciation. How generous are we of spirit in thanking people and loving on people? And he asks about our habits of giving and volunteering, financial and otherwise. And then we look at what are the patterns of our generosity? What are the actual patterns of our generosity, right? What do we actually do? And then what do we aspire to? And then it's a practice of bridging that gap. This January, as part of our UUI Adult Religious Exploration Program, we're going to offer a short course on the generosity path, exploring some of these exercises and more, as we talk about our relationship to giving and how we can grow in our capacity for generosity. So look for that. But I would suggest, supplementing Ewart a little bit, that we also start with an abundance assessment. An abundance assessment. Because if we aspire to give more abundantly, we need to feel more abundant. We need to feel our own abundance. If we aspire to greater courage in the way we share our gifts with the world, we need to know the strength that underlies that courage. So the question I want you to take away from this service today and to think about and to talk about with your partner or your friends or your family, to meditate on, journal about, however you process these things, right? The question I want you to take home is, what are all the ways in which your life is abundant? What is your abundance? And literally write it out. See how many things you could identify. And so, this certainly means things like money or assets or physical resources, for sure. Write that stuff down. But also your education, your training, your skills, your knacks, your networks, your people networks. Write that down. Could mean your time. Could also mean things like energy or talent or toughness. If you're abundant in toughness, that's a strength that allows you to risk more in the world. What about being abundant in optimism or determination? And then it could mean things like love or laughter or memories, wisdom, friends, family, our companions, human or otherwise. And then beyond, your abundance could be a perfectly seasoned cast iron skillet. Those often come with stories, I've noticed. It could be a picture in a locket. It could be a green thumb waiting on the spring, or the luminous glow of the moon in the night sky. What is your abundance? And I want you to think about, what are the inward springs from which your generosity can flow, and what are the resources that give you that resilience to risk being vulnerable? Ewart points out that the root word for generosity is related to generativity, to creativity, to abundance. And a synonym for generous is magnanimous, which means great in spirit. So what is going to feed your great spirit? Now, it's also important now to say that sometimes we are in a place in our lives that is not abundant, not even intangibly so, right? That's real. We can truly be in a space of just getting by or not even getting by. We might be tapped out on our physical or material resources. We might be in serious need. We might be situated physically, mentally, or emotionally in such a way that effort is not ours to give, right? And so that is okay. I want to lift that up. That is okay. The poet Jess Reynolds, in the poem When You Are Weary, writes that some days it is enough to breathe, to put your face in your cold hands and tell your palms and the empty kitchen that you don't know what to do. Some days, he says, waking up is enough. Putting on shoes before you walk out on the wet leaves that plaster the driveway is enough. And it is enough, he says, to love one person, one dog, one tree in a neighbor's yard, one 50-cent mug at the thrift store. If we are situated such that we cannot give in resources, time, or energy, we can be like the Buddha. We can be generous in our intentions. We can send ever-expanding circles of love and kindness out into the world with our thoughts. We can pray for people if we pray. We can meditate on compassion. We can love one person, one dog, one tree in a neighbor's yard, one 50-cent mug at the thrift store. Generosity as a transformative practice is accessible in almost any context. And if it is not, as I always point out, this is why it is good that we live out our Unitarian Universalist values not as isolated individuals, but in religious communities of mutual support and encouragement. This is why it is good that we come together, because there truly could be a time when I can't do the thing. I just can't. Or you can't do the thing, or any one of us, and then someone else will do the thing until it is their turn to rest, and then someone else will do the thing. We need each other. Right? That's not a bug, that's a feature. Unitarian Universalism as a religious tradition aspires to create ever-expanding communities of inclusion and care and kindness, within which we are free to be ourselves, but also we are responsible to one another. This is our vision of beloved community. It is a vision rooted in optimism about our own ability to create good things together, and rooted in gratitude for the abundant resources we have been given with which to create. And generosity is a practice that brings together all of these things. Care and kindness for one another, confidence in our gifts that allows us to risk an uncertain future, trust that allows us to be vulnerable with one another, and gratitude for the abundance that we have, which becomes the abundance that we share. May we grow in our practice of generosity as individuals and as a community, so that our abundance in all of its many forms can become a part of the abundance of the world. Blessed be. Amen.